Everyone, and welcome. My name is Brian. I'm one of the key guys behind the development of Holacracy, which is a system for self-management that some of you may have run into. But today's webinar isn't directly about that. This is a talk that I originally prepared when for an executive retreat at Google. They wanted me to do a talk not directly about Holacracy, but about some of the lessons around empowerment that we've learned as we moved into this self-management system and space. Uh, and they specifically asked me when I developed this talk to challenge their ideas around empowerment, to be provocative and interesting, and maybe take an unconventional view of empowerment. So that's what I tried to do in this webinar. Thanks to Google for making it possible for me to have this new talk. It's different than my kind of standard Holacracy introduction. So if you want that, please check out one of our regular webinars. This one was intentionally scheduled to talk more about the topic of empowerment and hopefully to leave a lot of tips for any company, whether or not they're doing self-management and Holacracy or anything like that, but any company that wants a more empowering environment. So with that said, let's dive in. If you have any questions as we go, please do use the chat in the lower left. We've got about 75 minutes in total. About an hour of that roughly will be used for the talk, and then we'll take some questions at the end as well. So please do post those as we go in the chat, and any other insights you want to share, do that as well. So I'm going to make our screen bigger here. There we go. So to start, let me ask you guys a question. So imagine tomorrow your manager says, hey, guess what? You're empowered. Congrats. Everything's fine. You have full empowerment now. Wonderful. So unfortunately, of course, it's not quite that simple. Uh, it takes more than just a boss saying, congrats, you're empowered. Great. To actually start doing things differently. So let me ask you a question. When you think about either the environment you're in, the company you're in, or a previous one, whether you're on the front line or the CEO, doesn't really matter. What's in the way of your empowerment? What's getting in the way? What's stopping you from using more power, taking on more, and just driving change forward? And just share in the chat for me whatever comes up when you think about what's in the way of your empowerment. And let me challenge you on the question about the boss. What if your boss got out of the way and said, okay, you know what, forget it, do whatever you want, you're empowered, you're the boss now, whatever. Would it really be that simple? Are you now fully empowered, or is there something else in your way? Uh, if all that changed tomorrow was your boss saying, yeah, do whatever, you're empowered. Tell me, what else is in the way? Think past just the boss. What else is in the way of your empowerment? Yeah, so Rebecca, hey, nice to see your name. Fear of messing up, right? So that's a great point. It's not just the boss, even if it's not fear of the boss, but just yourself, fear of messing up. That's great. Lack of information, right? So even if your boss told you you're empowered tomorrow, that doesn't necessarily help you figure out what to do when you don't have some clarity. Sometimes we're disempowered in organizations just because we don't know who to go to. We don't have enough information to drive something forward. Uh, Preconceived notions of how things should work. Yeah, that's awesome. That makes a lot of sense to me. Uh, People feeling they need permission even when they are empowered. I see that all the time in companies that have self-management systems even, and there really isn't a boss. And yet still people feel like they need permission somehow. And we're enculturated. We've grown up in environments that just reinforce that in our broader culture. Lack of trust. Yeah, great. Uh, Enough support, resources. Yeah, definitely. A lot of things, in other words. So there's an irony in empowerment. And this is one of the key things I learned on my own path to searching for ways to have a more empowered organization. Uh, and the irony is, if you need someone else to empower you, what does that say about the system you're in, right? There's an irony here. If you need someone else to empower you, the system you're in is not very empowering. Even if someone else does empower you, even if you've got the best boss in the world, if you are dependent on that boss for your own empowerment, you're in a fundamentally disempowering system. And ironically, by empowering you, your boss is reinforcing the idea that you are a victim that needs somebody else to empower them. The terrible irony. I ran into this as a boss that wanted to be more empowered. The more I tried to tell people, all right, you're empowered now, I was simultaneously sending the message that you're a victim and you need me to empower you. And with that comes, don't do anything I wouldn't do, or don't do things that the way I don't like, or I might disempower you. I might unempower you at the other side of that. And even if I wouldn't do that, the threat is there, right? So I think it's a fascinating irony. And if we really want empowering environments, we need to be really careful about just looking for bosses who empower others. And as you guys listed, the boss is really not the only thing in the way of true empowerment, right? So there's a great quote that I just love from a book I read recently. It was written by Captain Marquette. Wrote a book called Turn the Ship Around. And he was a captain in the Navy, and he took a ship from being the worst performing in the fleet to one of the best performing in the fleet in a lot of different measures. And one of the comments he points out is uh, don't empower, emancipate, right? One of the things he did was go to the heart of the rules that were getting in the way. He went to the Navy manual, right? The actual regulations that were governing the ship, and he changed them. So instead of just having, telling people you're empowered, go, he looked for what's shackling them right now. What are the processes and the systems and the rules at play that get in the way of people finding and using power on their own? And then he tried to remove those constraints. And this was one of his quotes. I think that lesson is really valuable for anyone that wants a more empowering environment. For the would-be empowering boss or empowering manager, if you want to be a more empowering manager, I'd say you probably want to spend less of your time trying to empower people, whatever that exactly means. I'm still not quite sure. Telling people they're empowered, encouraging them to be empowered, whatever. And more time looking at what are the constraints to them naturally choosing to find power, to use power. Uh, and work on those. Work on breaking the chains that are holding them back instead of pushing them to go further with their power. And I think some of the lessons I can tell you from my own work in this, real empowerment requires a lot more than empowering managers. It requires a system and an environment that supports that with less things in the way. So, ironically, it requires boundaries and structure and rules, the very things that we often perceive of as in the way of empowerment. And in fact, often they are. Right? In a lot of environments today, the rules are in the way. The structure is in the way. It's not lightweight, nimble structure that supports people finding power. It limits them. It's bureaucratic. It's needless. Uh, Yet, those two yellow lines on the center of the highway, they rarely feel disempowering, right? They are rules, they are boundaries, but they're nice, requisite ones that help you go fast. Right? They help enable speed. They help enable local adaptation because they're giving you just a basic boundary to stay within. When you're driving on the highway, don't drive on the left-hand side of the road or the right if you're in Britain or anywhere else that has that backwards driving thing, right? So I find it wonderfully ironic, but the would-be empowering leader would do really well to look for where are the boundary structure and rules, constraints getting in the way, but don't just remove them. Figure out which ones would actually enable empowerment, because you can't just throw them out and expect empowerment. Ironically, if you don't know the limits to your power, you actually don't know your freedom to use power either, right? Because there are always boundaries, there are always limits, there are always constraints. And if you just have a boss that says, no, really, there are none, go do anything, it's a lie. That somewhere, really, there are boundaries and rules and constraints that you better honor. And if those aren't clear and transparent for you, if you don't know where they are, you also don't know how safe and free you are to go use your judgment and take action. So, if you want an empowering environment, ironically, you need to clarify that. You need to have clear boundaries, constraints, rules. You need clarity. And That's actually the opposite of what most people do when they try to go create a more empowering environment. They focus on just ignoring them or trying to work around them. I'd say you do better off removing the ones that are really in the way and replacing them with real genuine clarity so people know their freedom. So, as an example of what that looks like, here's Holacracy's approach. Holacracy tends to focus on clarifying boundaries and constraints and power, uh, starting by defining small, clear roles and then clarifying what power those roles have. So, here's the role I'm filling right now today, my Holacracy spokesperson role, right? And my role has a purpose, which tells me why does my role exist? What am I trying to achieve? But it also tells me, as a general rule in our system, when you fill a role and you have a purpose, you have the freedom to go do anything, make any decision, or take any action to get that role's purpose expressed, to do that work. And the same with my accountabilities. This tells me what others can expect of me. So it gives me a little bit of a constraint. I need to find some way to do these things, right? But it's up to me how. I have a lot of authority and autonomy in how I go about expressing these accountabilities. But I do need to be able to account for them, right? To find some way to manage that action and figure out what that means and what I'm going to do with it. So it gives me the sense of at least some basic constraints of figure out how to do this. And also it tells me as long as I'm serving that purpose, not my own ego, not my own ideas, but that purpose, if I'm serving that purpose there, then I can go do anything that makes sense to me. Right? As long as I don't violate an explicitly defined boundary or rule. Right? So we do that as well. So here's another example of how that plays out and how we clarify boundaries in this system. This is another role I work with, our web architect role, filled by my colleague Olivier. And this role has its own purpose, right? It's trying to create a clear and sexy website for our organization. And this role has what we call a domain. You can think of that like property, right? It controls our website. So what that tells me is in my spokesperson role, I have the authority to do anything to express my purpose. But a boundary I have to honor is that I can't mess with the website without the web architect's permission. Right? So now we're starting to carve out territory or boundaries, which ironically, again, when we look at empowerment, we often think about breaking down walls, but it's just as important to define the right walls so that I know I have freedom as long as I don't cross it. And this is telling me I can do anything as spokesperson. Go do whatever makes sense to me. Go talk to the media. Go write a blog post. Go do anything I like. But if I want to link my blog post from our website, I need this role's permission. So it's giving me a basic constraint that also tells me the freedom on the other side. I can do anything I want. I can write anything I want. I can post anything, update other sites, update my social media accounts, whatever. Just don't mess with our website without this role. So that's an example of how this plays out. This is actually the same system that's used in society with clear property boundaries, right? I know that I'm free to lead my life as I see fit, as long as I don't violate my neighbor, right? So I know if I need to go to the airport tonight, taking a trip, I know not to just go take my neighbor's car to the airport. Right? That's his property, it's his to control. I have a boundary that then tells me as long as I'm not messing with somebody else's life and property, then by all means, go do whatever makes sense to me. So same system we see in society, which is also a system that actually allows quite a bit of empowerment. We don't need a king telling us what we can do as peasants owned by the king. We can have freedom because we also know our limits. I know not to mess with my neighbor's freedom. This brings that into an organization. So that's one way of achieving this with holacracy. There's another piece I want to mention here. Real empowerment also requires a process. It's not enough to just have this clarity that I just showed you. You need a way to evolve the rules because no matter how much we try to remove the bureaucratic ones, all constraints, all boundaries tend towards bureaucracy eventually. I can tell you some of the best, lightest weight rules that we thought were awesome and were for a while eventually proved to be in some way, shape, or form bureaucratic and in the way. So if we want to keep an empowering environment, we need to be able to change the rules and change the boundaries so that when we start seeing ones that maybe at one point were empowering and now have become shackling, we have some way to evolve them, to change them, right? Some way to evolve those rules. Because if we don't, people will still find a way to work around them, right? This is an example of some of the many ways that people work around the rules and constraints in a typical company. Without a process to change rules, without a way to update the boundaries and the constraints, people are just going to ignore them anyway. They're going to work around them. Ironically, playing politics is often an empowering thing to do in most companies. It's not only that, it's also tends to be very ego-serving at times, very destructive. Culturally, it has lots of issues, but at least people are working around the rules that are in the way or lack of process. So you need some way to change them. And Holacracy's approach to that is to add a governance process in every team where that team can set its own rules and change them over time. So in this case, my spokesperson role, our web architect role, and a whole bunch of other roles that are all part of our outreach function, our marketing function. We call that a circle. We have a governance process. They come together about once a month. They're all invited to show up and propose changing any rule, any constraint, any policy or process of this team that's in the way. And by doing that, they can take a rule and they can propose getting rid of a policy. If there's a policy in the way, just propose removing it. If somebody else really needs it there, then there's a process where that person can say, wait, here's some part of it I need. And let's whittle it down to just the minimally sufficient necessary constraint to make sure everybody is playing together in a way that doesn't limit someone else's empowerment as somebody pursues theirs. Or to use my example with my neighbor, right? We need some basic property lines between us. This governance process is about sorting out where those are. Unlike real estate, they're a lot subtler and they tend to need to change in an organization. Property lines are not quite as concrete. So we need some process to figure them out, to sort it out, to realize, I've been being empowered in my spokesperson role, but maybe sometimes I've been stepping on the toes of another role to do it. And if my empowerment is killing the empowerment of someone else, we need a way to sort that out and figure out where the boundary is, where the constraint is, so that we can both be empowered together. And that's what the governance process is all about in Holacracy. And other self-management systems out there also have some way of sorting out the boundaries. So the irony is the more empowering your environment, typically the more clear your constraints and the more you have a way of updating them and changing them over time. So another point I'll make here, if you're seeking a more empowering environment, one of the things to watch out for is your good ideas. Ironically, good ideas often get in the way of empowerment. I see this especially in some of the companies we work with that have a lot of really smart individuals. Sometimes when you get, like this happens in software teams quite often, where people are really intelligent, they have a lot of ideas about how they think the constraints and the boundaries should be set up. And if you let people just start defining constraints and boundaries based on their good ideas, what you end up with often is a bureaucratic mess. You end up with over-design. You end up with a system that is designed theoretically based on what we thought we would need, but it maybe gets a little distanced from what reality tells us we actually need. And the alternative here is to design a system based on your actual tensions, right? So if you want to design the minimally sufficient constraints to enable maximum empowerment without causing harm in the process, right? You want minimally sufficient constraints. The best way to learn what those are is to pay attention to the feeling you get by working in that environment. Where's the gaps you sense between what is and what could be, right? So if we call these tensions in Holacracy. So these tensions, it's the feeling, the experience of something that's off, something that could be better in some way. And it might be exciting, it might be an opportunity. It's not just problems, right? It's just the feeling of a gap between what is and what could be. And if you design your minimally required constraints just sufficient to solve the actual tensions people have run into, you end up with a design that evolves instead of one that is imposed, which is where I think a lot of rules and constraints start feeling bureaucratic. They're imposed from above, predicted to prevent tension. And I think the alternative here is embrace tension and realize all of it is teaching us something. So instead of trying to prevent tension, let's just get so good at responding to it and evolving the design of our organization that we don't need to prevent it. We can use tension as a learning opportunity in the vast majority of cases. Now, of course, there are some tensions you still want to prevent. But really, in most businesses, that's a tiny minority. More often than not, as long as you can learn quickly, tension is a teacher. So embrace it. Drive change with tensions. And part of that means bias for action, right? If you want an empowering environment, it needs to be okay to create tension, right? And I find this to be a fascinating shift, cultural shift for a lot of organizations that are trying to build a more empowering environment. Uh, we tend to have a bias for preventing tension and playing nice with others, right? We don't want to step on other people's toes, so we try to get consensus. We try to build buy-in before we act. And yet I find so much more power in uh, creating a culture where it's okay to just take action, knowing you might create tension for someone. But you know also that that person has some process, what we just covered, for learning from that tension and for encoding the minimally sufficient constraints to prevent the tension from becoming a pattern going forward. Right? And if you have that, then it's okay to bias for action, to say, let's just be tension creators. Let's use our judgment and take action as long as we're not violating an explicit rule or constraint that we know we've defined minimally sufficient, then create tension. And sometimes we'll then define some new constraints as a result as we learn from that action. But bias for action, not consensus. Consensus, more often than not, ironically, gets in the way. We think that's about giving everyone a voice, and maybe it is, but it's certainly not about having a truly empowering system. If you have to get everyone's buy-in before you can act, you're not very empowered. On the other hand, when you're free to create tension and know we're going to learn collectively from that, that's much more empowering. So, a final thing I want to say here: empower the process, right? So, what I'm pointing to here, again, we have a process for learning, and what you really need to empower is not the people; it's the process. Emancipate the people, empower the process. And ironically, one of the best ways you can do that again is through a good set of rules, the very thing that often gets in the way of empowerment. And there are many examples of this, right? The book I mentioned, the captain, one of the things he did was go to the actual rule book and rewrite it. Interestingly, he also comments that he's not sure he actually had the legal authority to do it, but he did it anyway. He rewrote the rule book, but he actually wrote a rule book, right? He changed it. There are other examples of empowering processes that are grounded in rule systems. Holacracy, for example, has a constitution. Uh, it's a rule book. Any game you might want to play, if you want a really empowering experience where the game doesn't need a heroic leader telling others what to do, you probably need a good set of rules. A good set of rules that everyone knows, here's the freedom to act I have within the rules. And the rules kind of act as the glue to bind us together instead of a boss that does, and all of the issues that come from that. So uh, if you are a boss, one of the most empowering things you can do is create a rule book, whatever that is, or use an existing one. Use the Holacracy Constitution if you're going to use Holacracy. But create a clear set of rules that tell people, here's your power. You don't need to come to me to be empowered. The rules there themselves are empowering. Right? The rules create an empowering system. Um, and of the things I've noticed, this is really difficult, even when you have an empowering system with a rule book that gives people basic power, minimally sufficient constraints, clarity, and people really do have real power in that environment. It's still not enough. Often you'll see people falling back to old behaviors, old habits of deferring to someone they view as a boss, someone they view as a leader, and not owning that power, even when they really have it, even when the whole system is designed to create fundamental power. You need to change people's mindsets about power. And that's a really interesting challenge, right? A great illustration of that, this is a fairly famous example or story, elephants. If you look at elephants, a pretty big animal with a lot of muscle, and how do circus trainers and other animal trainers that use elephants, how do they keep them from wandering off? That's a lot of muscle that can pretty easily wander off. And you may see occasionally elephants in a circus tied with a rope to a peg, driven into the ground. Well, that elephant is more than strong enough to simply pull the peg out and walk off. That doesn't take much muscle to do, and elephants have a lot of it. So why? Why doesn't the elephant wander off? And the way the animal trainers get the elephant to not wander off and rip the peg out of the ground, they start when the elephant is very, very young. And this time, even a young elephant could pull the peg out. They take a very heavy iron spike and a chain, and they chain that thing to the ground. And the elephant tries. They try to pull the peg out, and they learn they can't. And after enough struggling, they simply learn they cannot pull the peg out. Even as the elephant gets bigger and stronger now they actually could. And then they replace the big metal peg and the metal chain with a simple wooden one and a simple rope. Ironically, now the elephant really could wander off, but it doesn't even try. It's learned that it isn't empowered. It doesn't have the ability to just pull the peg out and wander off. So there's kind of a learned helplessness here, an enculturation that happens. And I think we see that in our organizations too. If you're trying to shift from a classical organization to one that is a more empowering environment, you have to wrestle with this challenge. People have years of learning that they're not empowered and they better not use their authority or their voice. They could get fired for that or punished in any number of ways. So even once you shift the environment, you got to then figure out how are you going to show the elephant that they really do have power now. How are you going to change all that history? And here's my tip for that. There's two ways we can look at trying to enact that change. We can look at changing people's thinking and hope the behavior follows, or we can look at changing behavior and hope the mindset follows, the thinking follows. And I think this is another place where there's something counterintuitive here. When I first entered this whole world, my natural inclination was to try to change people's mindset because I realized that's where the fundamental, sustainable, lasting change is. It's when people's mindset shifts, their paradigm changes. That's where you get the sustainable change. So I naturally tried to work on changing people's thinking, their mindset. And I learned it's insanely difficult. It's incredibly difficult to get the change that way. And ironically, even when you get a little bit of mindset shift, often the behavior doesn't follow. And then as behaviors go back into old habits, you lose the mindset shift, right? So one of the things I've learned, and this is a lesson I've seen a lot in the whole self-management movement, if you want to get sustainable change of mindsets, it's actually usually better to start with changing behaviors and then supporting the mindset change following that. It works much better. For example, my own life, I just went through a diet and exercise change program that was a year-long change. One of our clients actually does this, a company called Precision Nutrition, really cool virtual online training coaching program. And I lost 40 some pounds through this process. It was a really big life-changing experience for me. And what struck me most is I was extremely daunted going into it. I thought it was going to be this massive, incredibly difficult change, and I had to rewire my mind and all this stuff. And then I showed up, and really they focused on just change one little behavior. That's it. One little behavior for a couple of weeks. And then once I kind of got that little tiny change down, they said, here's another behavior. Now try changing this one. And it started with eat whatever I'm eating, just eat it slowly. Well, that's not too daunting, right? I got that down. And now, okay, now eat whatever you want, eat whatever you've been eating, but just stop when you're 80% full. You're mostly full, but not stuffed. All right, that wasn't too bad. And now another change and another change and another change. And before I noticed, before I realized it, they started giving these lessons to help me kind of process the experience of changing behaviors. And the mindset shift started going with it. Before I knew it, I had a completely different sense of identity around eating and exercise. And yet they weren't working directly on changing that. They were working first and foremost on changing my habits and my behaviors. And the mindset shift followed. It followed in a major way for me. And it was very sustainable and well past the end of their program. And, I look at pizza now that I used to love and I think, I don't want to eat that. It's actually sustainably changed my entire relationship to eating. I never thought I could do that. It really was one small behavior at a time. And I find the same approaches work really well organizationally. If you want lasting behavior change, you want lasting mindset shifts, Focus on one small habit at a time. And if you want empowerment, right, focus on the same thing. So there are a lot of habits that can go with this. In Holacracy, we focus on some when we're helping a client with this shift. We focus on simple things like when you feel a tension, right? You feel tension, just write it down. Really simple act. It doesn't take a big mindset change to just notice when you're feeling some tension about something and write it down. But that's the first step to maybe another behavior, which is now when you get into a governance meeting, look at the tensions you've written down and bring one up. Right? And that's the first step to actually starting to change the organizational structure and culture with it. Uh, so there's lots of little things like that, but those kinds of habits are the ones that, or changing things at that level, the level of habits, is where you're going to get to sustainable change more often than not in an organization. I've had much more luck changing hearts and minds by just focusing on changing behaviors and letting people think whatever they want. I find it also much more honoring. One of the things I loved about my own journey through the precision nutrition program was they never told me I should think differently or be different. And if they had, I think I would have taken a message that there was something wrong with me as I was. I think I would have resisted it. It wouldn't have been comfortable. Instead, no message of there's something wrong with how you are, who you are. Instead, here's a habit. Try it. See if it works for you. So, something to consider for our organizations. Uh, what you end up with when you put all this together, if you succeed in creating a really empowering system and environment, is a totally different way of achieving order, uh, which is where I think the real juice is, the real meat of the shift to a more empowering system. And you see this in the self-management space quite often, and with Holacracy. When you end up with a system where everybody really does find and use power, and they locally adapt, you end up with a different way of getting order in a company. Much like we see in society, actually, it's the same paradigm at play. Instead of a king imposing order and directing the economy top down, which is not a very empowering system, you end up with something much more like our societies today, where you have a lot of freedom and individuals adapt to their local circumstances, which is why I can pretty much go to any modern city today and just trust that I'm going to be able to get a taxi to a hotel, find a place to sleep, get a meal, meet any basic needs I might have, and none of that needs to be top-down planned and directed. Instead, it's emergent order. It's the order that shows up when we have free agents within a framework of rules, right, with honoring proper boundaries. I don't generally worry about my taxi driver deciding he'll just walk off with my laptop. Not that crime doesn't happen, but generally in a modern society, most people are playing by these basic rules of the game. They're honoring basic boundaries, which allows all of us to show up with autonomy and freedom and adapt. And that enables a completely different way of ordering a system. So you end up with emergent order versus imposed top-down order when you have that kind of autonomy and freedom, which to me is the ultimate goal and the reason, organizationally at least, the reason why you might want a more empowered system. It's to benefit from the power of emergent order, which tends to be a lot better at adapting to a complex, uncertain, chaotic world than top-down imposed order usually succeeds at. So if you want to deal with today's world, which is certainly a lot more complex, uncertain, it's changed a lot in the past handful of decades even. I think we need to look at more empowering systems to get the benefits of that emergent order. One approach to doing that, I've given you some stories from, is Holacracy. If that interests you, you can learn more. Holacracy is basically an overall end-to-end new system for making sure you get all of the benefits of an empowering system with all of the things we talked about, the boundaries needed, the clarification, the process to change that. So check it out. Of course, you're here probably because you've seen something about Holacracy. You can find a lot more about it on the web at holacracy.org. And to give you a glimpse of just kind of how this ends up looking, here's what an org chart looks like. This is my company. It's very different, and what I love most about it, it's organic, it's living, it's breathing. These are changing constantly. Each of those little green dots is a role that has clear boundaries and clear authority, and works together with lots of other roles, and people show up in many of those roles, often through many circles. So we see here just a much more organic way of breaking down work. It looks more like for me, an organic cells within organs within a bigger system. It's more like how a human body is organized than a typical top-down company. So you can check it out again more online, all about Holacracy if you're interested in that. One other picture at how this scales. This is shared with permission. This is Zappos, one of the largest companies today doing Holacracy. Uh, and I would say that this is their org chart, but it's actually not anymore because it looks totally different now than when I took this screenshot a few months ago, which I love. Again, it's how many companies with a couple thousand employees do you know that can radically restructure their org chart in just a few months, and that's a constant living, breathing process that's emerging from within and not a top-down big reorg that's often really disruptive and only done every few years. This org chart looks very different now because they're constantly processing tensions. They're constantly sensing what could be better, what's in the way of our empowerment, what boundaries do we need so that I can be empowered even while you are, right? We're constantly learning that. They're constantly learning that, and it's changing. It's shifting the structure. So this is something else you'll see with a lot of self-managing companies that are doing empowerment really well. There's often more structure, not less than a traditional management hierarchy. There's more clarity, more boundaries, but they're also more freedom. There's at the same time, they're not at odds anymore. I think we often see boundaries and freedom or structure and freedom as opposed. And I think the beauty of any good self-managing company is that they found a way to integrate them. They found a way to use boundaries and structure in service of freedom and use freedom to create better structures that serve instead of getting in the way. So they're much more integrated. They're no longer opposed to each other, but they're actually each one harnessed and enhancing the other. So if you want more on Holacracy, of course, there's my book as well, Holacracy, the new management system for a rapidly changing world. Check that out. You can find more on holacracybook.com. And of course, our broader website, holacracy.org, as well, with lots more about this whole system and approach to creating a truly empowering system by empowering a process and emancipating the people. So I hope this has given you a just at least counterintuitive and perhaps challenging or at least not the conventional view of empowerment, a different way of thinking about it, a different angle. I like to think that one of the things I've learned along the way is that a lot of my original ideas about empowerment might have been true, but were incredibly partial. They simply didn't recognize the need for so many of these other things that I always thought were at odds with empowerment. And if we want really empowering systems, I think we need to embrace them instead of rejecting them and make them work for empowerment. Structure, boundaries, rules, clarity, process, all of those things. So with that said, I'll wrap up our official presentation portion here and move into final questions. We've got a little bit of time, so I'm more than happy if anyone wants me to speak to anything else or dig in on any questions, please do jump in and ask. Just paste them into the chat for us. For anyone ducking out now, thanks for your time. Thanks for joining us. We will have a recording of this made. It'll probably be posted to our website. So hopefully, if you have anyone that you think might benefit from this counterintuitive view on empowerment, please do forward them to that. And thanks for joining us. All right, so let's go into questions. So I'm going to just scan here. If I miss your question, feel free to repost it here for me. Is it weird to say I heart Holacracy? Well, I heart Holacracy too. So at the same time, it's just a tool, but man, it's a tool that I just love. If you want an empowering system, it's a tool that I think it does a really, really great job. So let's see, would this work in a regulatory environment? Yeah, I think so. I think there are a lot of ways to get more empowerment in those environments, and Holacracy is a tool that is working already. There's Washington State is experimenting with Holacracy now in one department within the broader state bureaucracy. They're blogging about it, so you can read about that online if you just Google Washington State and Holacracy. So lots more to learn about that, but so far, I think so. And in fact, compare that to traditional ideas about empowering by just cutting out and removing clarity and structure. That's definitely not going to work in a regulatory environment. But when you have a system that still is giving you clarity and boundaries and structure, it's just making them more nimble, more agile, and more requisite, more aligned with the real needs. I think that's much more likely to work in a regulated system or public company or whatever kind of constraints we're talking about. When you're not trying to reject the whole idea of controls and constraints, you're just integrating them and keeping them lightweight, minimally sufficient, and grounded. All right, let's see. What other questions do we have? Don't you think that even that organizational structure is also hierarchical? I think it is impossible to think of a non-hierarchical organization. Uh, I find the distinction not really all that relevant. It's not that I don't say holacracy is non-hierarchical. Uh, Holacracy uses hierarchies in lots of ways. It's just not the kind of hierarchy we're used to. Usually, when we talk about hierarchy in business, we're thinking of a hierarchy of people, managers, who can direct other people and have pretty much unlimited authority to break down the work for those people, fire them, hire them, tell them what to do, and all that. A management hierarchy. Holacracy does not use anything quite like a management hierarchy. It does have a hierarchy of sorts. There are circles that have basically it's a hierarchy of purpose and a hierarchy of scope. So broader circles get to define the boundaries around subcircles, but those subcircles then have total autonomy of how they organize themselves. There is no people hierarchy, people manager hierarchy in holacracy. But of course, hierarchy is a type of structure that's all over the place, and you'll end up with hierarchies in lots of ways. I'm a pretty good public speaker, and so in my company, we have other people that are not as good at public speaking. There's a natural hierarchy there. I don't have the authority to tell them what to do, right? But they might look to me for guidance. And at the same time, one of them is better at other things than me, and I might look to them to guidance. That's another hierarchy. They don't have the authority to tell me what to do, but I might look up to them in other skills. So natural hierarchies exist all over the place. And holacracy is not about trying to crush hierarchy as a type of structure. Rather, it is replacing the management hierarchy, people directing other people, as a way of achieving order with a different process for achieving similar results. We still want clarity. We still want breaking down the work. We still want structure. It's just getting there differently with holacracy than we're typically used to. All right, let's see what else we have here. Would holacracy work in an organization of 5 people? Yeah, there are many companies that are in that size, 3 people even, using holacracy, 4 people, 5. There are larger ones, but yeah, absolutely. It's used by lots of small companies like that. Let's see, how does holacracy work with a bonus system? Yeah, is there any issue? So holacracy doesn't have anything to say directly about bonus systems, but I do think compensation generally, including bonus, whatever compensation system we're talking about, can either reinforce and enhance a generally empowering system, or it can get in the way. And that's true whether you're using holacracy or any other approach to self-management. The book I'd recommend, actually, check out Dan Pink's work. He does some awesome work in this. There's a book called Drive, which covers this, I think, really, really well. He looks at a lot of research and studies and just wisdom around compensation. And especially, he looks at how incentive compensation often gets in the way and hurts autonomy and self-organization in general. So my general advice is if you have a performance-based incentive compensation system, bonus system, you really want to double check that. Those get in the way more often than they help. So just be really skeptical of those systems and consider instead maybe there's some other approaches you could take that would more work with and enhance a self-organizing system and not work against it. Again, read Dan Pink's work. He does a far better job than I can of describing why and what the alternatives are. So check that out. Again, holacracy, you can try it with or without it. It just may get in the way if you have a traditional bonus system in place. But you know what? One tension at a time. If you adopt holacracy, you don't have to change your compensation system right away. Just be prepared for it to trigger some tensions, perhaps, and need some evolution with time. So I see another question here. What are experiences concerning startups? Holacracy is used in a lot of startups. I think in many ways it's easier to adopt holacracy early and grow with it than it is to retrofit it to a more established company with more history and more culture built up and all that. That said, it's still a major shift because even if you start at day one in a company, you probably have people that are used to a management hierarchy, that are used to the typical kinds of environments at play. And that's going to take some relearning. It's going to take shifting the way they're used to organizing and relating to power and doing it differently. So, something to watch out for. The learning curve is still there, even if you start from day one, but it is generally easier to scale with it. All right, let's see, what else do we have? How do you convince the management to give up holding the reins? So we usually don't try directly. When it comes to selling something like Holacracy, a distributed system like this, um, I think experience sells far better than anything I could tell someone. So what I usually offer, if companies and management teams are curious about how to get more empowering environments, um, could a self-organization system like Holacracy work for us? Could it teach us something? The best thing I can tell them is don't try to think about adopting this and changing your whole power structure right away. Instead, take a taste of it. We usually will do a 2-day workshop with an executive team or management team to give them a sense of how this thing could work. And so it's just take 2 days. Do Holacracy on your management team for just 2 days. And we'll put it through Holacracy's governance process using your real issues. We'll put your team through, bring your real tensions, your real issues that you're currently facing now, and see how this process works with them. See how it would work with them. We'll create an initial role structure and see what authority and autonomy that would grant, what clarity that would give you. Would that leave you with a more empowering environment, one that's better able to handle your tensions? Uh, the experience of living it and doing it, even briefly, will sell it far better than any convincing you might do. So the only convincing I usually try to do is if someone's already curious, just try it, take a taste, low commitment. And if anyone out there, by the way, is interested in that, we do those, and so do other organizations around the world with Holacracy specifically. So check our website for more, or reach out to us. Um, it's a really powerful way to get a sense of what a distributed authority system like Holacracy and all the empowering dynamics that come with it, what that actually feels like and looks like in practice. Let's see, what else do we have here? Um, All right, let's see. A lot of questions, so apologies in advance if I don't get to all of them. I'm going to do what I can. Um, uh, what would be the effective way to bring this in the government? Yeah, when upper management is not interested in change, should you try bottom up? So I wouldn't say you shouldn't try it. I just warn you, you're in for one hell of a challenge. This is a really difficult shift, ironically, to bring in from the bottom up, even though it's all about empowerment. It's all about that. If you have a system where power is held at the top in a strong management hierarchy, and those at the top are not interested in creating a more empowering system, it's incredibly difficult to make a change. Not to say you shouldn't try, just realize the monumental task you're up for. I rarely see it work. It's much easier when those at the top actually are curious and interested in a more effective approach. They don't have to be totally bought in up front, but they're at least curious and open and interested in exploring more effective ways to organize. That said, there are examples of people that are bringing it in, not from the very top. The example in government of Washington State is another really interesting example to look at there. You have a kind of a mid-level person, a deputy director in one of the departments, who's leading the charge to experiment with new techniques. And he's brought it in and piloted it on a team. He's using that to get data. And now the next phase, he's partnering with Harvard Business School to do an actual study on before and after. What are the effects? He's got a control group, a group in their traditional organizational system. So he's doing all of the footwork to build the case of why the organization should even care about this, to help maybe convince the upper management to go further with this and to kind of spread it at more of a grassroots level. Now, that presents all sorts of challenges, and time will tell if he's even successful with it. Early results are promising, but he's got a huge bureaucracy he's trying to shift there. But you know what? Those kind of experiments and efforts are where we're going to learn together how do we shift some of these really, really big organizations where you don't have the interest coming from the top. So hats off to him and anyone else out there. You asking the question, if you decide to try to do something in a bigger company from the bottom or the middle, good luck. You're up for a big challenge, but hopefully a rewarding one as well. All right, let's see, what else do we have here with our questions. How does this work in a volunteer organization? Yeah, so pretty much the same way it does in any organization, just creates some interesting challenges. I'll probably not have time to speak too much to all of the details of what comes up in a volunteer organization, but I'd encourage you, if you have questions like that or any others about Holacracy, we have a community of practice. You can find it linked from our website, or just go to community.holacracy.org. And you'll find discussion forums on there, post, ask questions. There's lots of people in that broader community using Holacracy as a tool for self-organization and self-management. So those kind of more detailed questions, you might get some interesting perspectives on from there. Or finally, another thing I'll mention, if you want to dig deeper into Holacracy, we also do public workshops. You see a list of them, taster workshops they're called. These are little half-day tastes of Holacracy, and that'll probably give you a better idea for what it actually looks like in practice and how it would apply to volunteers or anyone else. So you can check out, there's a few of those currently scheduled coming up in the middle box on the right there. Or if you want to dive in deeper, we have deeper trainings. They're 5 days that really go into how to do this and live it. They're called our practitioner trainings. You'll see a few of them coming up. Next one in December in Silicon Valley. And then we're back in Amsterdam and then back to Seattle. So check those out if you're interested in the deeper dive into what this whole Holacracy thing is all about. Let's see, what else? So who decides how to hire people and put them in a position or fire someone who isn't performing? Yeah, so with Holacracy specifically, Holacracy doesn't tell you how to do those things. It gives you the way of deciding and changing it with time. So let me put it in a different frame just to reflect a question back to you. How many of you listening out there, how many of you ever have tension with the way your company hires or fires? Right? Have you ever had a sense of there's something about that that is not as good as it could be with the way your company hires or fires, whatever that way is today? And if so, what can you do with that tension to drive change to that process? Can you easily, quickly, clearly bring that tension somewhere where you completely trust that within a short period of time, it's going to get processed and change the way you hire or fire? Right? And for most people, I would venture a guess that you're probably saying, no, it's not quite that easy. That's the typical answer I get. So the goal of Holacracy is not to tell you how you should hire or fire. It's to give you the process to change however you're doing it regularly and learn as you go. And you're going to have to change it because if you're doing Holacracy, you don't have the management hierarchy to rely on. And if your way of hiring and firing is the manager does it, you're going to have to change it anyway. But often when companies adopt Holacracy, they end up with something that looks pretty similar to that. They have one person with the authority to hire or fire, or maybe one person per team or whatever. And that looks a lot like a management hierarchy, but only day one. And with time, it then evolves away from that. As the team learns, wait, there's better ways to do this. And so in my company, we don't have anything that looks like a traditional manager hiring or firing. We have a process that can fire and a threshold to hire as well that involves multiple people in multiple roles with lots of voices involved. And same with firing, actually. We have a group process, and it's really not even the group that decides, it's the process that decides. We have a group that's involved in providing some input into a process, and then a formula where if the process results in everyone involved saying X, then somebody's fired or whatever. So there's a whole process for it. So anyway, but my point is that process is unique to our company. Different companies doing Holacracy will do it different ways. You can use ours to start with if you want to do Holacracy, and it's a pretty cool process. But then you're going to have to evolve your own because people will have tensions, whatever way you do it. And the goal of Holacracy is not to get the perfect answer to that up front. It's to give you a clear channel so that you can change anything in your organization. Right? So if you're finding ways that you're hiring, you're firing, your compensation, your performance management, whatever processes you have, your budgeting, if any of that is causing tension, what can we learn from it and how can we change it? And with the theme of our talk today, especially, how can we change it to allow more people more autonomy, more power, more authority, remove the constraints to it? Firing is a great example. If people are scared that there's one person, the former boss, who can fire them, that's going to be a huge obstacle to somebody finding and using their own power. Even if that boss wouldn't just fire them on a whim or a knee-jerk reaction, it still will get in the way. People will be afraid of it. So one of the things you'll have to do if you want a more empowering environment is probably update your firing process and not vest that in one person's hands, but instead distribute it. Find some way of getting at least a few people. Two is better than one. Some double check, some process, some transparent process, even better. Right? Some way that people can rest comfortably knowing here's how people get fired, and I don't have to worry about somebody firing me from their own knee-jerk reaction to me using my power in a way that they didn't like. And once you have that in place, you have a more empowering environment. So I'd say that's the main focus for trying to empower people. All right, let's see. Other questions. Is it possible to use holacracy in part of an organization only? Yes, it is. And it's more challenging that way. But it's very possible, and there are many examples of companies doing just that. So just be prepared. The place it gets more challenging is the rest of the organization will often interfere with your own team's ability to be fully autonomous and self-organizing and evolve anything. Or there'll be things out of your team's control. So for example, if your team doesn't have the authority to change your compensation system and your bonus system or your firing process or whatever, then you can't do what I was just talking about. If you cannot change the way your organization fires, then there's a limit to how much you can really do in your team. But that said, you can still probably do pretty well. So I wouldn't let that stop you. If you have a manager somewhere in the middle of the company that says, hey, on my team, I want power. I want a truly empowering environment. Not just me telling people they're empowered, but a truly empowering system. I think Holacracy is a great tool for that, even in the middle of an organization somewhere. All right, let's see. Yeah, so what happens with the bosses in the first stage of holacracy, and what can help the bosses to let go of their power over people? Um, well, going back to what we were saying with behavior change, they're going to need to get into some new habits. And it's not that the people that are filling manager roles suddenly become irrelevant and need to leave. Often those people have great talents and skills that are really valuable. Uh, they just aren't needed in the same kind of boss people direction coordination role. They might be needed in lots of other entrepreneurial roles. In many ways, when they adopt holacracy, the shift is from being a manager to being more of an entrepreneur. So those who are used to just coordinating and managing people now will have to shift into how do I build systems and processes and add value and scale this organization beyond my own direct heroic leadership. So this is the same journey that every entrepreneur learns. I learned this firsthand as I was building my first company, that if I really wanted to have a company that could scale, I needed to not be the heroic leader that solved everything myself, but rather I needed to focus on how could I build systems and processes that allowed this company to scale beyond my own direct involvement in everything. And unfortunately, that's a lesson that many managers have not learned, even as many entrepreneurs do. And frankly, even entrepreneurs wrestle with that. I still wrestle with that. It's hard. Holacracy is just a tool that will kind of force you to do that. It doesn't let you just be the heroic leader all the time. This is a lesson we learn in other parts of life too. If any of you are parents out there, you've probably realized or are in the process of learning how to not just be a heroic leader for your kids all the time, but instead to help them build capacity. For example, if your 2-year-old child runs out across the street, it's probably a good thing to be the hero, grab them, pull them out of the road, save the day. But if you're still doing that when they're 18, you may have missed your job as a parent, right? Your job is not to get stuck in always heroically saving the day for them, but it's to teach them to look both ways. It's to build their capacity to lead their own part of their life, right? And I think the same is what the managers have to do when they move into a system like holacracy and they lose their manager authority. They can no longer just be the heroic leader that saves the day for everyone and ironically disempowers them in the process. Now they have to actually find ways to build structures and systems and capacity. And there's lots of need for that. So they often have lots of work to do. And I'd argue that it's usually more powerful work for the organization than whatever they were doing as a manager, which is almost purely waste. But it's a hard shift. Some managers won't make it. Some will. Some will love it. Some will hate it and will make the shift. It's a whole spectrum. But it is a big change from the way we're used to organizing. All right, let's see what else do we have here. Would you use Holacracy as the base structure and base process for a fresh startup? And if not, at what stage would you introduce it? Uh, so if you have the ability to do it half decently, then yeah, it's way easier to do at the beginning. And we've worked with a couple of startups that either brought it in at the very beginning or very early. And it tends to work really well and be easier than bringing it in later. But the need is still, there's a learning curve. So if all you have is people immersed in management hierarchy, it might be challenging, and just be prepared. Someone is going to have to take the investment on of learning how to do this well, or the company will have to spend cash resources to bring in an external coach, or maybe a little of both, right? You can send someone to a training. Those 5-day trainings are great for that, and then they can come back in and do it yourself Holacracy adoption internally, and that can work. Um, Even better if you can get a coach and bring them in, your odds of success go up, but your cash burn also goes up. So uh, that's the big question. It's more about resourcing for a startup. But if you can get at least some support or some training, then I definitely would. For me, it simply works better than a management hierarchy at scaling and adapting to the fast-moving world of a startup. So, having built companies with management hierarchy and with Holacracy, I would generally prefer Holacracy in almost all cases, as long as you can get some basic investment in capacity or coaching or something for it. All right, let's see, what else do we have here? I just saw the question about profit sharing, probably when I was talking about bonuses. I do actually think profit sharing programs can work really well and be very compatible with a self-organizing system. We have one in my company. It's not individual performance based, it's overall. We have profits, some percentage of them get shared out and divided across people. So I think that does work really well. Team bonuses, I'd again be really cautious about, unless it's something really almost dumb like profit sharing. It's if it's based on incentives of any sort, of goals, targets to hit, I think that's fraught with peril. Not that it can't work. In fact, the trouble with incentives is they often do work. They just have second order consequences that are not what was anticipated when you put in place the incentive. Uh, and that's the big danger. So again, check out Dan Pink's book Drive, really wealth of good information about that. Do you use or employ psychologists for helping with behavioral change is another question. Um, Many of our Holacracy coaches also have backgrounds in psychology of some sort. They're not necessarily psychotherapists, but they have training in some form or another in some aspect of psychology. And I do think that training goes well and is well used when we talk about behavior change. So yeah, it's a good skill to bring in. All right. I think we have time for just a few more here. So, how well does Holacracy work with Scrum? So my background is in software. It works incredibly well with Scrum. My company, Holacracy One, we have a software tool, Glassfrog, that helps with Holacracy. Some of the screenshots I showed in this presentation were taken right from that software tool. It's used to help an organization structure their company using Holacracy. And we have a team running Scrum in our company and Holacracy. There are lots of companies in the world doing Holacracy and Scrum together. Works really, really well. If you check on our website, you'll even see some what we call a Holacracy app. The metaphor being Holacracy is an operating system. You can then add apps on top of it. And in this metaphor, an app doesn't mean literally a piece of software. It means a business process that is built for Holacracy. And one of them is how to merge Scrum and Holacracy. So there's a Scrum Holacracy app in our app store on our website. And there's other apps as well, like our approach to compensation. You'll find that, our approach to firing. Those are all standard apps that you can build on top of and use with Holacracy and just see, or you can invent your own. But yeah, Scrum and Holacracy, highly compatible. Same principles behind it. Works really well together. In fact, I just got done, I gave a keynote at the Global Scrum Gathering in Prague, the recent one, in that community about the two together. So yeah, lots of connections with Scrum and Holacracy. All right, let's see. Is there experience with Holacracy at nonprofits? Yes, there are a lot of nonprofits using Holacracy. Actually, right now there are somewhere in the order of several hundred organizations all around the world doing this. More every month. It's growing faster than I can track even. Within that broader group, there's a really broad mix: for-profit, nonprofit, tiny little businesses, more mid-sized businesses, uh, all different industries, lots of different ones. Uh, all right, let's see. Is Holacracy resistant to power games? Um, yes, I wouldn't say it's foolproof, but if we compare it to what we're coming from, in most cases, it's the management hierarchy. I'd say Holacracy is far more resistant to egos infusing the organization and people playing power games than a management hierarchy is. Not that it magically turns people into saints and stops them from trying. It's simply more resistant. It's more. It holds up a mirror to it. It shines light on it. It makes it more obvious and transparent. All of which tends to decrease the behavior, and it also protects it. There's rules in Holacracy that stop people driving decision making and governance with their own personal agendas and power games. Again, not that it's 100% foolproof, but I think it's far better than management hierarchy, and also of note, far better than more consensus-based or structureless approaches to self-management as well. One of the downsides of those is that they tend to leave more room for power games and egos. And Holacracy specifically has lots of structure and process in place to weed those out, to give everyone a voice without their egos being able to infiltrate and take it over. And if you want to see an example of how that works, Holacracy's governance meeting is a great thing to look at. If you want to attend one of our workshops, on the right there's a live simulation of those during that. Or you can watch a video recording of a governance meeting on our website in our resource library. One of the videos is a little simulation we gave of a governance meeting, and you'll see some of the rules at play for how Holacracy tends to artfully redirect egos showing up and power games that come with them into something more productive. So check out that video, or join us for a workshop. In addition to the in-person ones we have, there's an online one coming up. Next one of those is in March, and you can do that from the comfort of your own home. Let's see. I think we have time for one or two more. Now we're getting into behavioral economics. Oh, that was earlier. Yes, one of my favorite topics. I'll leave that for another talk. Let's see. What other questions do we have? What is a recommendation for those who don't buy into the Holacracy concept? So it depends what you mean. Do you mean a recommendation for like another approach to self-organizing? There's a lot around. To my knowledge, there's no other complete packaged systems like Holacracy. So your other option, if you don't want to use a packaged approach like Holacracy, is to home grow your own approach to self-management or self-organization and build an empowering system and culture. And that's what I did that eventually led to Holacracy and packaging it up into a generic system. The downside of doing a homegrown system is that it's about a 10-year process from experience to get one that kind of works half decently. So it's just a massive investment. It takes a lot of time and energy, and your business will suffer in the meantime. Mine did, big time. It's extremely expensive. On the other side of it, you can custom home grow something that's a perfect fit for your needs. That said, to use a metaphor, if you want an operating system on your computer, you could also home grow that. And yet most people find it works a lot better to start with a packaged operating system and then customize on top of it. Doesn't mean you have to use it exactly out of the box. You can lots of ways to customize your operating system. Put in all different, applications. My Mac looks probably very different than the next guy's Mac. Lots of things I can customize. If I want to, Holacracy is an open source operating system. You can even start from it and change pieces of it. Be careful. I also could install Linux on my computer and go change the code. It's all open source. I could cause more harm than good if I don't do that with a lot of expertise, but I can do it. And you can do the same with Holacracy. So my first recommendation for anyone who's not bought into Holacracy as their platform is still try it. Because even if you decide you want to home grow or start with Holacracy and tweak it or whatever, you do really well to at least figure out what is this package system. In the same way that if I want to custom create my own operating system, the best thing I can probably do to start is get really familiar with Windows, Mac OS X, and maybe a couple others that are popular operating systems out there. So if you want to custom home grow your own approach for self-organization, you're still going to do really well by learning what a whole community has built into this open source system of Holacracy over more than a decade now of experimentation. So start with that, learn it, and then by all means, build your own. Or, better yet, help us further evolve Holacracy if you find some part of it that doesn't work in your environment. I'd be surprised, but you might. And that's how Holacracy evolves. We're on version 4.1 of the operating system Holacracy now. Uh, it's managed the same way open source software packages typically are. The rules of the game of Holacracy itself evolve and change based on a community doing it and feeding back into it. So there are lots of ways I'm sure we'll continue to learn how Holacracy could be better, and I hope we'll continue improving Holacracy as a result. If anyone's interested in learning more about it, by all means, I invite you to dive in and be part of what I find to be an incredibly exciting journey, which is inventing new approaches to organizing companies and ones that move beyond just empowering people and instead look at creating fundamentally empowering environments. So with that said, we're at the end of our time block, so I'll use that as my final wrap up. And appreciate your time again. Thanks for joining me, and hope to cross paths with some of you in one of our in-person events or on our community forums down the road. So thanks again for joining me, everyone. Have a great day. Talk to you later.